mean, even the workplace is feeling more and more like that as well. You expect your job to be temporary. You expect it to have a, kind of a built-in expiration date, the specifics of which you may not know, but you know that nothing lasts. Every element of life. There's a feeling, at least among young people, that all aspects of life are like that.
Right.
They're not wrong. It does seem,
Yeah.
does the employer treat you like a one-night stand? That has actually happened.
That happens, yeah. And I think, capital has broken down kind of barriers to that over decades, really. Or more than decades, but I mean, especially in the last few decades, it's sort of breaking down the barriers to a kind of uninhibited sort of regime of exchange, and just pure exchange, where every worker is just kind of fungible and can be replaced by anyone else, and the same with relationships, and it is a kind of an inhuman environment, really, and we can see that people do not really thrive in this environment. Maybe some kind of psychopaths do, but most people do not thrive in this kind of very chaotic environment. So yeah, I think, go on. Yeah,
because there's a widespread sense of just contingency of whatever purpose you're serving someone right now or some institution. It's subject to change at any moment, and you can only sort of retrospectively think or look back and say, well, that one was something that that was a relationship that was preserved for a long time, but going forward, you never know how much you can rely on them, and vice versa. So this sense of being kept at arm's length and not, like essentially sort of expendable, that is permeating so much of our relationships now, personal, business, whatever. So
yeah, and it's very corrosive, really. People are not meant to feel like that about other people.
and in fact, if you complain about that, you end up looking a bit like a loser, because you should never project that lack of confidence in being considered worthwhile to somebody or something. So nobody wants to be the one to complain about being well. I was going to say being ghosted, but the term is being ghosted, right? For in a date, but employers will also ghost you. And there is actually, you find this more on the left than on the right. There is actually a tolerance of complaining about being so-called ghosted or cut off by employers. But if you apply that to the dating life, to your personal life, especially if you're a man, it looks like you're just complaining about some woman not wanting you enough, and that's a very bad look. And that pressure is also felt by women too. Oh, he ghosted me. You end up looking like a bit of a loser. So people don't want to complain about this contingent form of expendable, human condition, but we're all living with it, and no one seems to be able to snap out of it. It's just a giant coordination failure.
That's true. Yeah, and you remember the West End Caleb saga?
Is that like West End of London? What, I don't recall.
West End Caleb. Yeah, I mean, I think West End is some kind of furniture store, right? In kind of furniture boutique, so fancy furniture. And I got a feeling, that this was some kind of very clever marketing campaign. I'm not sure if it was ever established if it was a marketing campaign or not. But anyway, some young women took to TikTok to complain about somebody they call West End Caleb, who had ghosted them. And he was called West End Caleb because he worked for this West End firm, and he was a furniture designer. And all these women, were complaining about him in New York, and this became, kind of internet sensation. Was it like a promotional campaign for West End furniture or what? Yeah. Very Baudrillardian, in fact. Yeah, I think.
So I gather that it was thought of as perhaps a campaign, a marketing campaign by this furniture store because it made West End Caleb, who is employed there, look sort of cool.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, he might have looked cool to people who would, I suppose, behave like him. But for a lot of women, he didn't look cool. He looked, like a bit of a scumbag. But yeah, those women were kind of mocked, on Twitter, for example, for
right.
for taking to TikTok for complaining about ghosting.
Yeah. So I mean, women have they tend to have more leeway to complain without being cast as some sort of bitter loser who simply can't compete. But they feel all that pressure too, and they risk being thought of as some kind of femcel or something. The same thing happens. So.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, there is a fine line between what you can complain about and what you can't complain about, right? That you can be called, I don't know, reactionary, for certain opinions. So yeah, I mean, that just seems like I talked a bit about this on recent podcast with Aldous Astarian. He does the Forest of Symbols podcast. He talks a bit about J.G. Ballard. He talked about Ballard in that podcast, completely about Ballard, and Ballard's idea of sort of psychopathology as a kind of Darwinian adaptation. So people kind of developing mental illnesses as a way of surviving, really. So I think we're living in an environment now where people are going crazy in certain ways because that's the only way they can function. They can continue to function, as in this kind of crazy situation.
To get back to the employer-employee relationship real quickly, I've noticed that, the idea that an employee expects employer loyalty and their own loyalty in return is just so unbelievably anachronistic now. And in fact, I think if you were to give off that impression, let's say in an interview for a job, you would actually have a whiff of loserdom to it. You would come off as a loser. When I think of the people that have been most successful in Bay Area, tech workforce, they started looking for their next job, the second day of the job they currently have. It seems as if that's what they've been doing.
Right.
I personally have rarely left a job. My contract ran out and it wasn't renewed. And the ones who have the most luck seem to be just constantly hustling, looking for the next thing. And it's almost as if, the more that your resume reads as just one giant episode of discontentment, and the next, you actually look like a better pick for that employer.
Right.
So you're hot stuff. You have the confidence to leave whatever employer behind. It's almost like, well, that's a bad analogy. I was going to say, at least with sort of like criminal underworlds or something, if you sell someone out, or like, let's say in the classic 20th century tradition of, like being captured by an opposing army and giving up all your compatriots, that's a recipe for having no future with your current captors, because you're clearly willing to sell people out. That's a sign of your low trustworthiness. But somehow the opposite takes place in the private sector of Silicon Valley. Like having no loyalty is the sign that you're a great hire.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just a kind of nihilistic milieu. Yeah. I mean, that's they claim to have values, but I don't really believe in these values that they claim to hold. So, when you say, people are constantly hustling, I think, it's just a kind of an example of the way work and the demands of work, time demands, really. So it's just kind of ballooning, and escaping their confines, of the the work day, so that also people doing side hustles to make ends meet, and they just end up kind of just working non-stop, really, in one way or another.
Yeah. The U.S. has always been more like that than, let's keep it to Europe. This comparison has always been more like that. But, boomers, who end up being some of the biggest defenders of capitalism in theory, were able to enjoy a form of capitalism that was much less demanding on their every waking hour, and it hadn't really psychologically captured them the way that it had, or it seems to have, with younger generations who just expect to constantly have to switch jobs and expect to always have a side hustle. And in the last few years, we can add, expect to have to invest in crypto or in stocks with their Robinhood app. And you have to do all of this stuff if you want to have any shot at retiring. And you still won't retire with, a home and a boat like your boomer father and mother got to, but
yeah.
So
I mean, I suppose I'm increasingly getting, sort of sympathetic to the view that none of this is inevitable. That's the squeeze on living standards and everything is inevitable, but it is kind of to a large extent due to kind of elite groups refusing to do to carry out any reform, really, because they benefit from this situation so much.
I mean, right, older generations were simply, simply yes, but were essentially, they were competing with far fewer people for both jobs, for mates, for somewhat more miscellaneous and fleeting things that competing for. Here's one that sort of makes sense if you're a Gen X or older: competing for a spot at the local bar or pub if you're in Britain to get your band to play. Because all of this stuff seems to have just gotten worse. Especially in like the major metros where real estate has become more scarce, but populations have grown. Anything you might want to do out in the physical world, and it's just gotten the sense of competition has just gotten greater.
Yeah. I mean, I do think people. I mean, I've sort of been listening to Christopher Lasch, audiobook, The Culture of Narcissism. Of course, this book is over 40 years old now, but it is
a book, I believe. Yeah. I only read about a third of The True and Only Heaven. That's the last. For some reason, I decided to take a stab at years ago, and it was a sort of a intellectual history of other leftists and kind of their agitations in the 19th century and the kind of things they were demanding. Anyway, yeah. So, Culture of Narcissism, his most
Culture of Narcissism. Yeah. I want to get onto that, True and Only Heaven, but I haven't got to that yet. But Culture of Narcissism. I mean, he was kind of a bit of an anti-capitalist, of course, Lasch.
Right. Yeah.
Started out as a Marxist, gradually moved away from Marx. I mean, also kind of got into Freud, of course, and Culture of Narcissism is pretty Freudian, really, in many ways. And but he does sort of touch upon capitalism as a kind of war of all against all, at least in the sort of 20th century or late 20th century capitalism. And I think this is something we have to bear in mind. I think it's gotten more in that direction, really. And we have to kind of, I think we have to realize that we're being pushed in that direction by the system, and kind of try to resist that, kind of mentality, really. Now we see it, I think, with identity politics, sort of pitting groups against each other, whether it's political groups or ethnic groups or whatever, what have you. Sexualities and things like that. A lot of enmity between all these different groups.
I've heard it. I've heard the theory that identity politics is, in fact, the leftists' way of pushing back on this sense of greater competition, right? Like they find identity and a sort of collective security and falling back on identity as a way of, leveraging to get a job or leveraging to avoid losing a job. The good jobs, that is, like you get into a college-educated, white-collar type of work environment, that identity. I mean, I think it's a stretch. I don't see identity politicians, as it were, themselves really claiming this. I mean, I suppose they'd agree to the extent you're criticizing neoliberalism. That stuff is plenty trendy within those circles. Not as much as it is for the kind of classic socialists. but still, they tend to agree. So yeah, there is that theory that identity politics is a way of pushing back on this.
I think it is driven by that, isn't it? I mean, it talks about, to some extent, maybe, like, sort of idea of the Me Too, when Me Too took off some years ago, that there were, so many women who, found a way to maybe, climb the corporate ladder, right? By sort of accusing somebody, or in a way just kind of threatening to accuse maybe a superior of harassment. So and then of course there were genuine harassment as well, for sure. But I think when I look at it, the kind of wave of, it had a very chilling effect, I think, Me Too, where people felt, oh, I can't really say anything in the workplace anymore. I can't say anything friendly or flirty anymore. I think there was that kind of dimension to it, that it was used somewhat cynically as a way of advancement. And all these kind of identity politics, kind of cards, playing the race card, or playing the sexuality card, or the trans card, or whatever, is it does have that dimension, clearly, as a kind of cynical, calculating dimension.
The kind of right centrist IDW space, who are very much against the illiberalism of the woke left and the kind of racial collectivism, gender collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that they have an answer at all to the Laschian concern of the war of all against all. In fact, like, they seem to be sticking up for a form of individualist meritocracy that might even be more vicious. If you have, I don't see them standing up for, or at least exploring. I know it's difficult to explore alternatives to capitalism, but within capitalism,
right?
I don't see them really having that much of a concern. It does feel like a kind of milquetoast classical liberal individualism that, while I'm still largely sympathetic to compared to the woke left, I think is just really missing a lot of growing problems that are felt by people subject to this war of all against all, in this permeating sense of competition, right?
Right. And I think they just don't grasp the fact, like I said earlier, the capital is a force in its own right, and it's got a kind of, in a sense, it's got a sort of will to power, right?
So I think part of the appeal of Lasch lately is he represents a kind of family first anti-capitalism, and he has a sense that he had a book, for instance, called Haven in a Heartless World: The Family Under Siege, or The Family Besieged, something like that. And I think that he feels that the family is one of the last sort of refuges from that sense of competition in every area of life. That's just really a source of a lot of anxiety. Anxiety that I think is so low key and ongoing that it doesn't feel like something that just leaps out and ruins your day, but it's always there,
That's right. Yeah. And he's, that book, Haven in a Heartless World. I've started that book, and I'm really interested in that kind of analysis which he goes into that, about how the family has been kind of changed by, it's quite a Marxist view he takes, really, sort of changing modes of production and so on.
Yeah.
And I think this is something which is missing. The online right is kind of like the most active, sort of critical voice, right, of what's going on. Yeah. But it does tend to, it doesn't really have that, view, the sort of capitalism and its problems, which Lasch had.
So someone like Rod Dreher sort of feels around at the edges of that. He gets it, but it's as if some kind of woke bomb comes along at least twice a week that just is very difficult to resist, pushing back on its poisonous cultural elements, and you forget to speak to the political economy. Capitalism is this kind of vague background thing that's really led led along by technological changes that just don't feel that active. They don't feel like a live player, to use a term that that guy Sam Oberja throws around a lot. They don't feel like a live player in one's day-to-day life, but it's always there.
Right. I mean, I think it's becoming kind of urgent, really. I mean, because you got sort of BlackRock, for example, buying up huge swathes of American real estate. This is a major development, really. I mean, some people in the online right have picked up on that, but they don't really have their eye on the ball, in that department.
Yeah.
They are fixated on liberals, woke liberals, really.
Well, yes, because every day there's some kind of specific news event with names and faces that you can attach to it that are just so much more compelling to sort of pivot to constantly and discuss that, that just kind of the onslaught of current eventsism makes it more difficult to keep your eye on that prize or that ball, as you said.
That's right. Yeah. It's the old society as a spectacle again, isn't it? So,
right.
Yeah. I mean, the players like BlackRock, they kind of benefit from this distraction that we all are subject to, right?
Every time about a pink-haired cat lady, they win.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like a radical idea, but we want to ask ourselves, is wokeness really, so significant as it's assumed to be? I mean, I think it might well kind of fade away slowly, but then we find ourselves in a kind of neo-feudalism. It won't really matter, the wokeness has faded away. I mean, everything will be very difficult for ordinary people. As we see inflation taking hold. Kind of, if we're talking about food shortages now, even Biden's admitted that this will be happening. I mean, we're getting to really kind of deep water at this point, I think.
And what gets frustrating is that I still find myself pushing back on the specific claims of people who are uncomfortable with a lot of anti-capitalism. Like they'll say something like, well, this inflation is due to corporate greed. That's not really satisfying because corporations have always been greedy. So there is something else going on. It's unfortunate when the anti-capitalists, you feel that their sensibility is fundamentally correct, but they're led astray by these specific claims that the conservative think tank people, the economistic right, can easily swat down. So
I mean, expecting corporations to not be greedy is a bit ridiculous. Really. you have to sort of put a I don't know, framework in place, which prevents them from exploiting certain things, right?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the answer lies in government doing more, not so much what the capitalists or business entities being up to is so evil. They're just being businesses. The answer still lies in the government, picking up where they leave off, or even leaving off is not the right way to put it, but just filling in, that which they cannot do for the human condition. So that we need to get back to government doing more, rather than thinking that like pushing back on individual corporate evil or is really any kind of way to go, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. There needs to be regulation, intervention, all these kind of classic things, really. And it needs to be, I think, as I say, kind of people need to resist this kind of war of all against all, need to develop some kind of sense of solidarity, really. I think we need to sort of move away from this kind of racial animosity. It's a kind of unfashionable thing to say, right? On the dissident right. I mean, I don't really consider myself a dissident rightist. Maybe at one point I did, but not anymore.
It's amazing the degree to which the dissident right it seems so torn between thinking the solution is fighting the left's poisonous racial toxicity, or just advancing their own form of that. Some of them seem to have this sort of consequentialist, somewhat high-minded version of it, of defending that their own sort of racial ideas. by saying that the left, like, well, in their heart of hearts, they prefer not to do that, but the left is making it such that there's no other way to go.
Right.
Yeah. Part of me thinks sometimes they're correct about that, but I don't think we've reached the point where they're. I mean, we're not clans in the street duking it out like Ninja Turtles and Splinter or something. Like, it hasn't reached that point.
No. I mean, I think we have to accept that these different ethnic groups are different, and they will always be different, and that's okay. I think so. The dream of some kind of sort of multicultural society where everyone is kind of on board with all the same values is not going to happen. So in one sense, I mean, it's good that kind of delusion is gone, maybe, but I think we have to kind of prevent this slide into whatever it is, this kind of very dark ethnic conflict which we see happening.
Yeah.
So there's, I suppose, people of maybe our generation, so the Gen Xers, we were sort of raised as colorblind, we might say, which of course is maybe a bit passé now. We know that the ethnic groups are different; they will be different, and that's normal. So I think we can just kind of move forward with that insight without sort of embracing these kind of extreme, ethnic narcissism, I suppose.
Yeah. Sometimes I get this sense, because it does seem like within the right, like the younger you go, the more there's this sense that, like, white people need to start behaving the same way that Black Americans do in their political cultural habits or whatever. They start being more solidaristic. They'll be skeptical that Black-white relations can be positive. It's just it's always some kind of latent poison there or something. And I wonder, it's a combination of them not having lived long enough. It's a combination of them being often very online, very much in their bedroom all the time. But if you're Gen X, you've lived more of a life. If you're California Gen X, in my case, I have actually had, positive multiracial friendships. All this stuff is not some kind of liberal illusion. I mean, I have actually lived it. I know it's possible. But if you're very, you're a kind of a young, intelligent white shut-in, you might think ethno-nationalism is just obviously the way to go. It can't be any other way, because they just actually don't know from firsthand experience that actually racial, relations can be non-toxic. It's, it's often fine.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, obviously. I mean, there's nothing inevitable about it, is there?
Yeah, you're more likely to have a friendship fall out because you slept with their girlfriend, or if you have a business relationship that's cordial, you rip them off. Rarely do they give a shit about your race,
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I went to school, I mean, of course, most in South Wales, most of my classmates were white, but we did have a fair few, of other ethnicities. And there was never any problem, as I remember, with this mix. Yeah. I never thought of saying anything to anyone based on. Right?
Yeah, I remember my high school cafeteria. It's true that, to a large degree, the blacks sit with the blacks, the Asians sit with the Asians. But I also saw that people in band, which was multiracial, although there weren't a lot of black people in the band, I'll admit that. The band people sat together and the jocks sat together. So there are ways that people form associations that are not racial at all. But as sort of a fallback when you've got nothing else to talk about, nothing else that sort of captures your organizational attention and imagination. Yeah, it often is a fallback. It's true.
Right. Yeah. And it's this really. I mean, I used to consider myself, kind of firmly on the left. Let's say about 10 years ago. Yeah. And I became very disappointed by this kind of racial obsession which developed on the left. It seemed, kind of very, Marxist, I might say, not kind of like I was never a sort of doctrinaire Marxist, but I thought the sort of the good ideal, working class people kind of sticking up for each other.
Yeah.
I come from, well, I don't know why I would say working class or lower middle class background.
Yeah.
So I thought, what, yeah, that's good. When people have some solidarity with people who are kind of in the same boat, really. That's what we should be aiming for. And the fact that the left really destroyed that, I think, over the past couple of decades, is a big disappointment to me. So I don't know if we can get that back, that kind of idea of class solidarity, because so many of us are really working class, I think.
I mean, I do agree with the right, or with this isn't even so much right. I mean, given where I'm about to go with it, but the idea of class solidarity being undermined by introducing greater cultural diversity, because the cultural things, the cultural aspect of life is just more, just kind of more visceral and more immediately compelling to people.
Right. Yeah.
Does class solidarity more difficult? I believe that's probably true.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, actually.
But notice
it's something more immediate, and more obvious to people.
Yeah.
Whereas something like class may be more abstract. I mean, probably it can't be brought back in the same way it was, sort of working class solidarity. But I mean, I think what we see though is that more and more people are becoming, kind of proletarianized. Even middle class is kind of disappearing. If we say, so middle class is home ownership, really, and often, goes with that maybe, I don't know, owning a small business or being a professional of some kind. So, more and more people do not fit all of those criteria, home ownership and steady career. So you can say that they're working class, they're proletarians. So we're all ending up in that boat.
And the kind of people, I'd say the kind of people who advance arguments like the one we're making here, well, at least I made about, racial diversity making, racial and cultural diversity making class solidarity more difficult. They are often described as right wing, and yet what they're concerned about is class solidarity. So that's not a particularly right wing goal. They are not people who find the idea of a white ethno state a terminally attractive thing. So a lot of the argument over what is left and what is right is confused by kind of bad faith attributions all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, we have to ask who is the big threat, really, and maybe it is, people like BlackRock more than,
I don't know if
pink-haired ladies, right? So.
Yeah, well, it's been an hour, Julian. I don't want to keep you any longer.
Okay.
But, I know it's late where you're at, so thanks. Okay. We didn't get into the Substack, your Mother of All Battles series. Maybe we can do that next time, or if you have something new.
We can do, yeah. I mean, there should be something new on the Substack by then, yeah.
Cool. Maybe we'll do an all Substack pieces next time, so we can get to that and whatever new that you write.
Good idea. Yeah, excellent. Okay.
All right. Take care. Good night.
Take care. Bye.